I am the chair of Media Foundation. A very warm welcome to everyone. This evening, in collaboration with India International Center, we are conducting what we like to call a media dialogue, a conversation among media people, media participants, practitioners, and for the benefit of a much larger audience. We are this evening going to be talking about a very important subject of media's accountability and the role of reader's editor. But before we do that, let me just permit me to say a few words about the Media Foundation. This is a group civil society initiative which came about in the mid-1970s after the emergency, when Mr. B.G. Varghese, Ajit Bhattacharya, and many others senior journalists were concerned about how easy it was for the powers that be to make the media bend to its will. Since then, the Media Foundation has been able to keep the quest going for many, many years. We have two annual events, the George B.G. Varghese Memorial Lecture and Chameli Devi Awards. And now we have added during the pandemic, something called the Media Dialogue. So after this welcome, may I invite my colleague and managing committee member, Vibodh Parathasarathi, who is going to be moderating this discussion, to take over, introduce the participants, introduce the subject, and conduct the conversation. Over to you, Vibodh.
Thank you, Mr. Khare, and good evening to all of you. The word accountability seems to feature very often in discussions about the news media today. One way news organizations have tried to be accountable to their readers is by appointing a reader's editor, a role also referred to as a public editor or the ombudsperson of a news organization. Today, we talk about the role of the reader's editor in news organizations in India. The Hindu was the first to appoint a reader's editor well over a decade ago. The news websites Wire and Scroll did so about 5 years ago. And very recently, print also joined in this league. All the guests on our panel today have been associated with these important developments. We have Mr. A.S. Panneerselvan, who recently stepped down after 9 years as the reader's editor at The Hindu. He joins us from Chennai, where he is currently a fellow at the Roja Muthiah Research Library. From New Delhi, we have Mr. Siddharth Varadarajan, the founder, editor, and co-proprietor of The Wire. Dr. Rammanohar Reddy was the reader's editor at Scroll.in between 2016 and 2018. He joins us from Hyderabad and is currently editor of the online publication, The India Forum. We also have Ms. Shailaja Bajpai, who was recently appointed by the print as its reader's editor and is based in Delhi. Welcome to all of you. I am Vibodh Parathasarathi and I teach media policy at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. Let me begin with the imagination and expectations of the role of the reader's editor. Mr. Panneerselvan, you were the third reader's editor appointed at The Hindu. How formalized was your brief and how did you interpret your remit?
See, luckily I had precedence and the terms of reference was much more clearer. And another important brief, the pre-appointment brief was how they have conceived this office. And Mr. Ram, who was then the chairman of the group, explained about his interaction with the Guardian and how we looked at the Guardian model. And he said that even the terms of reference, what Hindu adopted, was very closely reflected the Guardian model. In fact, there was a discussion whether they wanted to have a reader's editor or a public editor. And they opted for reader's editor because they felt that with the reader's editor is supreme till the newspaper goes to bed. And then the reader's editor's decision on correction and clarification is binding. Whereas in the public editor, you come up with a advisory to the editor. The editor has a right to accept it or to reject it. Therefore, they wanted a system where it becomes binding. That's the reason they went for the reader's editor. For this briefing was very, very helpful. And the fact that I was a third reader's editor, by that time, people are used to having somebody looking at the next day's newspaper. From being a nitpicker, we have become much more, what can I say, less intrusive in the eyes of the desk. Desk always thought that the readers' editors are nitpickers. Then I think it took some time for people to come to terms with the in-house corrective mechanism. And nobody actually likes visible mending. Therefore, visible mending creates certain amount of heartburn. And though you don't spell out the names, the fact that it's a visible mending creates heartburn. And the way it took some time for people to come to terms with this visible mending mechanisms.
Yeah, I'll come back to this important phrase called visible mending later on as we go on. But if I may turn to Mr. Varadarajan, you were familiar with the figure of the reader's editor while you were a journalist and later an editor at the Hindu. Yeah. But as a proprietor of an online startup, why did you invest in such a role?
Siddharth is muted.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah.
Hello? Yeah, okay. So I found the institution of a reader's editor or a public editor. Frankly, I don't make much distinction between this, the terminology, the precise terminology. And I'll explain also why our own terminology has gone through some shift. We started by calling Pamela Philippo's the Wire's public editor, and now she's the ombudsperson. There's a very specific reason why I had to change the name, which I will explain later. But for me, it was always going to be the case that the Wire would have this kind of a person who would be outside of the editorial chain of command and would not be an employee. This is very important. I mean, even in the case of Panneer, the fact that he was not subject to any editorial chain of command within the organization, but was free to comment on the contents. It's an act of empowerment that you must encourage in order to have some degree of public accountability for your readers. And for us at The Wire, this was important also because when we began publication in 2015, we envisaged The Wire as striking a new kind of social contract between journalists on the one hand and the reading and viewing public on the other. And we were making a conscious break with existing business models of media, which depend on venture capitalists and investors and advertisers for the bulk of their financing. And we were very confident that in the long haul, it's the readers and viewers who are going to sustain the Wire financially. And it was important that they have full faith and confidence in the journalism that we were doing, and have a channel whereby they could raise questions and doubts and concerns, and have them addressed. We were also happy and are happy, and we constantly do address reader complaints. But we felt that having somebody outside of our sort of editorial structure would be an added layer of transparency, and would strengthen this idea that The Wire is really a publication which belongs to its readers and viewers, and and we want to go the extra mile in addressing their concerns and questions. So, I had seen what the Guardian had done, what the New York Times, Washington Post, various people who've experimented, and as soon as we were in a situation, we started The Wire in 2015 really on a shoestring budget, and did not really, and we moved into an office only 1 year later in 2016.
Okay, I think we've lost that line. So I'm sure Mr. Varadarajan would come back. If I may move on in the meanwhile to Dr. Reddy. You were appointed as the reader's editor at Scroll around the same time as The Wire appointed theirs. But in your case, this was after a very long stint as the editor of India's premier academic journal, The Economic and Political Weekly. So I'm wondering, how did you imagine the idea of a reader's editor in a news media?
Both Scroll and The Wire appointed the reader's editor at the same time. And Scroll was, it was a little older than The Wire, but it was also new. And when they approached me and asked if I would like to be reader's editor, actually I was quite excited and I jumped at it. Of course, I left EPW at that time and I kind of retired, but it was not so much that I was looking for something, as I thought that here is an opportunity to stand outside and effectively communicate with the publication on behalf of readers about what should be done, what is done right, etc. Because that is something that I always felt as a reader of other publications. Over the decades, I felt there must be some way to communicate this, and rarely is it there. Letters to the editor are a different channel, and so when the editor of Scroll, Harish Fernandez, approached me and said, "Would you join?" and I could see that they were keen for another reason, not only to speak on behalf of readers, but also I think they felt that because I'd been, so many years as editor of EPW, etc., I could perhaps be able to guide the publication, in certain areas as they set about establishing with themselves. So that was the logic, and my own, as I said, I was quite enthusiastic to take it up, and I was there for 2 years, and I left. Not because I had any difference of opinion with the publication, nor because, not for any other reason other than we were starting this new publication, India Forum, and I felt that, I needed to step down. If I can, you see, during my term there and afterwards, I was wondering whether in a new context, and I'll explain what this new context is, what kind of role this reader's editor can have. I feel that now it's more worthwhile to see that position as an editor for the publication rather than for the readers. And let me explain. What you're seeing now, not just in India, but in the US, UK, elsewhere, is a kind of concerted attempt to delegitimize media. Okay, it's done by government, it's done by political forces, groups all over. So the media, in a sense, is under siege, and it is not so much that they have lost legitimacy with readers and viewers, but not because of what they are doing or not doing, but because, as I said, they are being delegitimized. So in this kind of situation, what exactly can a reader's editor do is something that I was thinking about at that time, Scroll, and later. And maybe the second round, I'd like to come back to this issue.
So, thanks very much. Ms. Bajpai, your columns talk a lot about bias and prejudice in sections of the news media, both print and television. What was the specific gap that your organization wanted to address by appointing a reader's editor?
I mean, I think, and first of all, thank you for having me on this panel. It's a privilege to be with everybody else. As I said before this began, I feel like a little bit of an imposter since I've only been in this role for 4 months now. I think we were probably moved by the feeling that the reader deserved respect in a way that I don't think we always think legacy journalism or print gave the reader. And that perhaps accountability and transparency was, of course, there. Readers already comment on social media and other forum, but a lot of that has to do with trolling the journalists. And I think the idea, at least and as I have tried to explain it to myself, has been to try and to bridge the gap between the reader and let's say the print in this case, to honor and give them the chance to say what they want. And I have found so far in my experience that they're just so happy to be replied to, right? In a way that I feel that they felt that, nobody cared about them. And then suddenly I get all these people back saying, thank you so much for replying. Thank you so much for writing about this. But actually, I felt a bit humble by it because I thought, oh God, does that mean that we have been so indifferent to the reader? And by we, I mean journalists and media as a collective, that people feel the need to thank me for what I'm just replying to them. So I think that kind of reinforced my belief. I wasn't given any brief, by the way, by the editor-in-chief and publisher, Shekhar Gupta. I'm still finding my way around. Therefore, to imagine it, I, of course, have read Mr. Panneerselvan for many years. I follow Pamela frequently, and we've all read John Budsman's columns. I just felt that perhaps my role was to be both to play it on behalf of the reader, to represent them, and try and engage with them and perhaps explain where the print came from, how to start journalism, because so often I feel that the reader or the public doesn't quite understand the constraints or compulsions that are faced when you're doing a story. And that if I could play a constructive role there, it would perhaps be more valuable to the reader than to simply act as some kind of judge and lay down the law for either the readers or for my colleagues, which of course I don't see my role as at all.
Yeah, thank you for this. I was sort of looking around elsewhere in the world, and I was struck by the fact in the Swedish press, 2 terms were employed for the reader's editor. One translates into quote unquote debate editor, and the other roughly translates into sender to the editor. So in a sense, this takes us to the nuts and bolts of what all of you are involved in here. And let me begin with Ram right now. Did you feel that the feedback from the readers was kind of frivolous or nitpicking, or could you tell us something about the kind of concerns that were aired by the readers of Scroll at that time? Ram, if you could.
Of course. Yeah, I was going to say that my experience was quite different. But let me say up front, actually, readers rarely communicated with me the 2 years I was there. Okay. Now, why is that so? I don't know. The position was prominently advertised on the website of Scroll. It was posted on social media. In every column that I wrote, I had a fortnightly column. Every column I would encourage readers to write to me. But very few over the years actually did. But it's not as if the readers of Scroll were, very quiet or, they were not really communicating. They were hugely, Scroll has, as you may have seen, has a very prominent letters to the editor column. They give a lot of space. They were there. They were very, very active on Facebook and Twitter, more often than not trolling Scroll and its writers. But very few of them actually wrote into the reader's editor. So, we thought about it. I and the editor talked about it. Why is that so? And in parallel, what was happening was then the column became a kind of suo motu. I would take notice of what Scroll did, what didn't do, and put on the hat of a reader. Sometimes put on the hat of an editor. Sometimes editor meaning as I would have liked it to be, and took up a number of issues. That is a different matter. But I thought about it a lot, and I think I spoke to Panneer also once or twice about it. And because our experience was quite different from that of the Hindu, and for a while I was also tracking what Pamela was doing on Wire. At some point, I thought that she was also not getting many, but I may have been mistaken. This comes back to what I said earlier, that basically the readers have come to feel that the media is not speaking with them or for them, and there is no point communicating with them either through the letters to the editor column or the reader's editor column. We will vent our spleen on social media. So I interpret the lack of communication from them for this reason. It was I wouldn't call it a frustrating experience. Of course, I found my own remit, and I think the publication found it useful, and the occasional reader also did. But the vision of a reader's editor speaking on reader can speak when the readers themselves. The reader's editor can speak when the readers themselves speak, but here they were not speaking. I used to go to social media, see what they were saying, and then bring that in, and that's not quite it was. And I would just like to add, and Panneer would disagree with me quite a bit. And this is also a time when we saw around the world that the office of the reader's editor in different parts of the world were being dismantled. At that time, the New York Times got rid of its reader's editor. The Washington Post got rid of its reader's editor. And the Guardian, there was a gap for other reasons. And I did attend a meeting of this organization, ONO, the Global Ombudsman Newspapers, etc., in Chennai at that time. And what I noticed was this institution was very strong, more in the electronic media, and more in Scandinavia, Canada, etc. And it, I really don't know. Maybe I'm reading things wrong. Maybe I'm reading into the lack of communication of Scroll readers, interpreting it in a certain way. But this is what it is. In my experience, they were not communicative, but they were very, very active on social media. It's a big mystery because after me there was Kalpana for briefly the reader's editor, and I don't think her experience was very different.
Just a little observation here. I did look at what folks would be replying at, and I think you had some sort of a template for the feedback, which had kind of many sort of questions being asked and specifics being talked about. Yeah. Rather than just an email and saying please write to us. I think that template is still on the website. So I'm just wondering whether there was a certain kind of burden put on the readers that they have to sort of fill up these various
Sorry,
pops
just very briefly, that wasn't there when I was there. We didn't have a template.
Okay.
Maybe it was
So,
introduced later.
right. Okay. So as of now, I see that, and I'm just wondering whether that, in a sense, sort of cuts down some of the freewheeling conversations that could, in a sense, come from the readers here. Shailaja, in a recent column, you mentioned, in a sense, it echoes what Ram is saying, that very few readers clutter your mailbox with their complaints. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
But then readers, of course, also air their views on Twitter and on other social media. So I'm wondering, how do you gain a sense of the entirety of the concerns of the readers, besides issues of trolling and other kinds of utterances?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Mr. Reddy that it's not as though I've been flooded with readers since the moment I did. But I do attribute that also to the fact that it's fairly new. I hope that's one of the reasons. How do I gauge it? Well, from what I have seen so far and from what I read on the comments made on the website with there. By the way, we have removed comments with individual pieces now because there was so much trolling of individual writers, and we have so many youngsters who have been writing that it became, a very poisonous space in a sense. And so I think we thought that perhaps the reader's editor would get a greater response because that facility wasn't available to them. I do look at what is said on social media, and from the feedback I get in general from whatever I've received, is that, so far most of it has to do more with technical matters of access either to the website or subscription issues. Or largely to point out small factual errors, which in most cases have been corrected. And we've had to concede and have corrected that. And then, as you mentioned, that I have received several, in fact, perhaps the majority of the complaints that I received were to do with what I said was called a bias, that either the opinion writers were biased or the print was biased in its reporting in terms of omissions. Largely, you didn't report, let's say, the violence during the Bengal Pol Post violence. You didn't report enough on that. You didn't report enough on the legal cases in the Delhi courts on the Delhi riots, right? So that was the kind of, and I sensed, and I got another thing I found interesting from even looking at other social medias. A lot of people had problems with headlines, right? Which made me wonder whether they, in fact, go very much further than the headline, because they would attribute many things to the article on the basis of that. And then, I would say, okay, but did you read the article? So I think that was a major problem that I have had to face about, is it bias? Is it not bias? And in whose eyes is it the bias there? Was the kind of feedback that I received.
Yeah, Paneer, I was reading your very last column as the editor of Hindu's Readers Editor, as Hindu's Readers Editor a few months ago, and you wrote, I quote, "An ombudsman is an active listener. I was not relying only on the mails that we receive daily. I read the comments that appear below the line for most of the stories online to understand the readers," unquote. What were the kind of unexpected learnings did you sort of benefit from such listening to your readers?
See, one thing which is very clear is after the second term of the BJP, that is after 2019, the type of communications what newspaper were receiving has changed dramatically. For instance, I used to get about 200 to 250 complaints by 6 o'clock in the morning when I haven't even got the newspaper, which means we know from where it is getting originating. With this transatlantic barrage of complaints, to even know whether the complaints are genuine or not, you want to look at people who are getting engaged. because these letters are replicating. In fact, the very first line in most of the cases was a giveaway. It will start like, I'm neither a member of BJP nor a RSS sympathizer, but then you know what exactly is going to come. And this used to happen in a particular manner. Therefore, to know whether there are real problems or not, you wanted to look at people who are getting engaged with the media. And that's the reason this comments, below the line comments, became very, very important. Because there is certain amount of engagement. It is not there to vilify a writer. It is not there to ridicule a viewpoint. Given the fact that we are operating in a polarized environment, to understand whether the complaint has any material base or the complaint is purely ideological, you needed some sort of an internal mechanism. And for that, the comment became a very, very important mechanism for me.
Right. So Siddharth, it seems, at least as of now in the discussion, that the reader's editor can stimulate a form of introspection that gets either bypassed in the daily pressures of your journalistic routines or gets deflected amidst polarized exchanges on social media. So for me, of course, the question would be, how has feedback from your reader's editor shaped discussions in your newsroom there?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Essentially, Pamela Philippo's, her column has typically 2 or 3 sections. One is a general review of, so one, she puts on the hat of a media commentator, where she looks at how the media as a whole has covered, the stories of the past week or fortnight, and where the wire may have scored or not scored. And that itself often serves as a kind of corrective for us. Very early on, for example, she was one of the people who would often point out something, of course, that we were aware of because we had financial limitations. But the absence of adequate ground reporting, for example, when events were breaking, that was a definite weakness of ours, which we have since moved to rectify to the greatest extent possible. And and then the other parts of her column reflect what readers write in, issues that they want, feedback that they give, and some of that feedback is useful. A lot of feedback is highlights problems that we are aware of, but which, for example, we used to allow readers to regularly comment on stories, and we did that for about a year and a half or 2 years. It was time-consuming and laborious because we realized very, very fast that you cannot allow unmoderated comments, because people get very abusive, people are defamatory, you can't. We didn't want, leaving aside the legal liabilities, we didn't want our website to host any content, even third-party content that had threats against people and communities and so on. So we decided that comments must be moderated, and we set up a system of moderation. But we just found ourselves overwhelmed, that we didn't have the staff strength to be able to do that, and so finally we had to junk reader comments. So many readers who write to Pamela lament the fact that they don't have, the only place they have to give feedback is through her column. And so she uses that. I mean, so she does highlight important letters or important responses that she gets in her column. So I would say that, if you, frankly, I would have expected, given the highly polarized media atmosphere in India, and the fact that you have virtually, you have political activists who game the whole social media and commentary system, that the public editor would be the target of sustained systematic campaigning and so on and so forth. But we haven't seen too much of that, and I don't think Pam has seen too much of that. There are some people who would write regularly and so on, and with the standard stuff. But on the whole, I would say that this has proved to be a very constructive form of engagement, particularly since we lack the ability to allow those daily conversations. Maybe something like what Scroll does is something we ought to look at, which is you have, I think, Ram, is it a weekly letters to the editor kind of page that they would do?
Yeah, actually, even twice a week.
Yeah. So maybe rather than sort of, although people like to comment, and there's something to be said for having comments below an article, but we just lack the ability to moderate those. So maybe doing a form of letters to the editor would take some of the load off, some of the tedious load off Pam's plate. But I would say that so far we haven't really. I mean, there've been a few times when sort of serious issues get raised by readers, and which then get amplified, and then we have a discussion and figure out how to handle these things. But in the main, I would say that the fact that we are very prompt, we try to be very prompt with corrections, we are transparent about them. This is another point I wanted to make, Vibodh, that the reader's editor column is only one layer or one aspect of what the media can do to engage with readers and be transparent. And since digital media can be prone, given the nature of technology, given the vulnerability of all media to manipulated news, manipulated media, manipulated photographs and videos, etc. It's important that when mistakes are made or errors of fact emerge, that these are corrected and that these are acknowledged as well. And I would say that it's a matter of great distress that the vast majority of India's national media does not believe that they need to be transparent on the issue of corrections, and on the issue, and corrections of fact, corrections of interpretation, or when a story is completely wrong. So you often, when a newspaper or a TV channel or a website decides to take down a story, you'll just get a 404 error page. There'll be no explanation for this. Or they will edit content, on the sly without saying exactly what the issue was. And, so I think that having a reader's editor is important. The public editor is important. And I hope that more and more media platforms do this. But it's only one part of what is needed to have that kind of extended and credible conversation with readers.
Sure, I think that's really well accepted. In fact, in your description of your public editor, you talk about it being as a added new layer of transparency. And I think that emphasis is pretty well taken there. There is a sort of another imagination of the reader's editor, which I've noted in the French newspapers here, because the designation there, they use the word médiateur for the designation of what we call RE or public editor here. And this seems to indicate a kind of a inward facing sort of function of the reader's editor's role there. And Ram, if I sort of might read out what the Scroll's website says in terms of the responsibilities of the reader's editor, in addition to, of course, complaints, two other points were there. A, to advise the editor on where corrections and clarifications are necessary, and to achieve how to improve standards in the magazine. Okay. Which of these did you give a priority, especially since you were there in the initial years there? And could you tell us something about the kind of discussions you had with the editorial leadership around these two responsibilities?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think in the end, how my role and work evolved was in terms of, what you say, the French term for it. I didn't know that, but that's how it evolved. Yes, you see, I had of course, like readers, editor, and other organizations, I was not reporting to anyone, although my salary was paid by the organization. And I was communicating only with the editor. I was not communicating with anybody else. In the first 2 years, as I said, that was also the early years of Scroll. I had a lot of suggestions to make to the editor, about not just what should be covered, and what should not be covered, but also how things were covered, what kind of commentary was published. So I would, independent of whatever he asked me, I would offer these suggestions. These were very suggestions, and less so in terms of very gross errors in headlines and things like that. Which I would see immediately. I would let him know, but I didn't really pay much attention to the small typos and things like that. Which I knew that they would get corrected. So it was much more. I think, and I don't think the editor said it just to make me feel nice, but my function there was more useful as in terms of advising, the publication of what, standing on the outside, of course, what they should do, how they were doing things, and they had just ventured into video. So video was also a new thing at that time, so we went into that. So a whole range of issues, and we would have a weekly conversation, but otherwise everything by email. There's just one thing, and I don't know again whether Paneel would tell us. Of course, my role, my work with them was pre-pandemic. But even at that time, I was in Hyderabad. The publication was headquartered out of Bombay. I had made 2 visits to Bombay to meet people, etc. I feel even a reader's editor, to be able to convey to the readers, should be able to have a sense of how things function, in the newsroom, in the organization, and also should be able to meet reporters, sub-editors, etc. And that was, by meet, I mean, in the sense of getting to understand, how things are done, how things are produced, and convey that to readers. Because as I think Shailaja said, sometimes there's a lot of misunderstanding of how things happen. It is important to sort that out. But I didn't have that opportunity. So when you are not, I think it's important, and there I think Panneer had a huge plus on his side. He was located in the office of the Hindu, even as he was completely independent of the editorial chain command. So if you want to make a contribution, I think somewhere that would make a difference. And I just like to end by saying that perhaps more than a reader's editor, what we need now is an independent office of media editor. An editor who not only speaks on behalf of readers, but would stand on the outside and look at the publication and the larger media landscape. I think the New York Times or Washington Post has somebody called a media editor, but that person may be, part of the newsroom. But I'm talking about an independent office which has a larger role to play than that of being a reader's editor. And that, of course, is born out of my disappointment with the lack of communication from readers.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. One of the things which you said was that you communicate only with the editor when you're in that role. And from what I gather, I think with Panneer, he was a bit known for writing to individual journalists in the organization to sort of comment and have discussions around that. So that's a kind of different kind of interface of the RE with the staff. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Panneer. Yeah.
See, the thing is, I worked with 5 different editors. Over a period of time, we also evolved systems. When I joined, Siddharth was the editor. And during that time, we started something called Open House, where we invited the readers to come into the newsroom. And later, when Mr. Ravi was the editor, we said that, look, no correction can happen without keeping editor and the reader set in the loop. Because that was the time we noticed that quite a lot of corrections were happening behind everybody's back. Therefore, this idea of visible bending became sort of a rule. And then we also created a yield structure called corrections, which means the mistake is being flagged both through the editor as well as to the concerned writer and the bureau. Therefore, we don't wait for the editor to come back and say that, yes, it's a mistake, so that you activate the idea of correction as early as possible. Therefore, it was a system that, though the letters reached the concerned journalist, editor was also kept in the loop. Therefore, editor knew that this is a concern which has been raised. Idea is that part of this visible mending is not to do anything behind anybody else's back. Therefore, the editors kept in confidence, but that's how that entire communication happened.
Okay.
Therefore, even when the reporter is saying that, yes, I got it wrong, reporter confirms it not only with the reader's editor, but also with the editor. Therefore, in that sense, it was much more easier to implement those corrections.
Yeah, in a sense, this sort of takes us to an interesting kind of question in terms of organizationally, the role and the networks of the reader's editor rather than pure sort of normatively. And I mean, so Siddharth, if I can come to you, I mean, news organizations have now many specialized designations. You have edit page editor, cricket editor, fashion editor, digital editor, and so on and so forth. Yeah. I'm just wondering how formalized is the interaction between the editorial leadership and the reader's editor in The Wire?
No, there is no formal interaction in the sense that the whole idea is that she sits outside the editorial pyramid, and if she needs to, but everybody knows that questions from her or queries from her need to be answered, and everybody is expected to cooperate with her. But the idea is that she sends her column in, and barring typos and stuff, we are obliged to publish what she sends. So there isn't that. I mean, it's not like, but you have to understand that Pam is also maybe this is again a constraint. It's a function of our own limitation. So Pam works. She doesn't come into the. She doesn't come to the office, and again, it's for her. It's a pro bono. It's a pro bono assignment that she's doing as a labor of love, really. And so we also, don't expect her to be kind of 24/7 handling sort of wire-related issues. But the fact is that everybody knows that her column, you can't tamper with it, and essentially when she if she has questions or queries, then they need to be resolved. And so that's the way it really ought to be. You can't, what you don't want is a situation of great comfort between the ombudsperson and staff, kind of coziness. So some distance is actually it's well advised. I wanted to say one other thing when my connection got cut off earlier, which is that both Scroll and The Wire are examples of digital publications that have not only shown a willingness to entertain and engage and address reader complaints, but actually have created a fairly objective, robust, and independent mechanism to do that. Which is why I found the IT rules that the government framed earlier this year to be especially galling. Because the presupposition was that that digital media is some kind of Wild West, unregulated, unresponsive. They can do what they like. And we said, hey, you want to now create a Sarkari layer of appointing a digital grievance redressal officer who will maintain a logbook and send you a copy. I said, we've been doing this from 2016. Scroll has been doing this from 2016. And so this whole idea that it's a government that is going to tell media how to handle reader grievances. It's quite presumptuous, quite apart from also being Orwellian, because you're looking at a bunch of people who are perhaps the least responsive to citizens' complaints and the complaints of the public at large, but who want to now dictate how the media should respond or handle them.
Yeah, sure. In a sense, I have also noticed this, that on the one hand, you have the RE position, which is a kind of self-regulatory inside the organization kind of role. And then there's now a pressure to sort of have a statutory role to provide, so possibly to try and address similar kinds of concern. Yeah. So I think that point is well taken in terms of what organizations have been doing and what they are now asked to do, actually. Paneer, if I could sort of again read out what you wrote about your role there, and I quote, "I have both boundaries and possibilities, and I respect the prerogative of editorial freedom," unquote. What are these boundaries, Paneer? Did it have to do with sort of reconciling the editorial freedom of your colleagues with the accountability expected from your role?
Not really. See, for instance, there are few issues where I have a very, very clear ideological position. For instance, on the question of nuclear weapons or even nuclear energy, I'm very, very skeptical of the Indian nuclear establishment. But if the newspaper is going to carry an opinion of people who are pro-nuclear establishment, I think that that level of pluralism has to be permitted. While I'm talking about pluralism, I also realize that pluralism is not a unending idea. I can't use bigotry as a history. I cannot permit bigotry to come in the idea of pluralism. I can't bring in misogynistic observation in the idea of pluralism. Therefore, where does this pluralism end? That's what I said about these boundaries. Therefore, it's essentially what you do is you critically evaluate it on a daily basis. It's not a blanket prescription. Therefore, on a daily basis, you look at it and you decide.
Right. Just to sort of continue with this idea, Shailaja, you continue to be a writer in the print after you were appointed as the reader's editor, if I'm right? So unlike Paneer and Ram, you straddle two very different roles in the news organization. Yeah. How do you manage not being adversarial or defensive vis-a-vis your colleagues, while at the same time building trust amongst your readers?
Yeah, it's a thankless task, isn't it? I mean, it's no win-win situation. You don't please your colleagues or your readers at the end of the day, right? They both are disappointed in you. I have to say, it has been an advantage that I was part of the newsroom for the last two and a half years before I was appointed reader's editor. I am no longer, after I was appointed, part of the day-to-day running of the paper in any way, right? So I have distanced myself from that role. I am no longer on the daily roles of the print, and nor do I, as I said, engage in any of the day-to-day functions of the paper, other than, as Mr. Reddy said, an advisory role now. I still continue to write a TV media column, which I have done since 1985. And other than that, actually, I don't write for the print. Okay, so I just write actually two kinds of a monthly column, which has now begun as reader's editor, and a weekly media column. right? So I think to that extent, I don't really have a conflict of interest there. I think the advantage I have is what Mr. Reddy said, the need to engage with the staff, to know my editorial colleagues. So what I do is whenever I receive any complaint, I make up, or any suggestion, actually, we get quite a lot of suggestions saying, why don't you cover this? And especially for Shekhar, for his program, Cut the Clutter, which is on YouTube. I get a lot of suggestions for that, which I just pass on, right? But any complaint that I do receive from the readers, I make it a point to share it both with, obviously, the managing editor and with the, to talk to or refer if I need a reply from the concerned reporter, editor, stroke, both of them. Right? Because I really do think I need to make this interactive and for them to be aware of what readers are saying to them, and for them both to give a reply so that I can see where between, where does the shadow fall between the editor, let's say, and the person who wrote the piece, right? And to in order to do that, I think it's very important that the I have that ability to engage with almost anybody in the office. I haven't had a problem so far. Anyone I write to or I meet, I go to office once a week. And in that time, whenever I have any questions, I directly address them normally to the person who's written it, keeping the managing editor always in the loop, so that there are two people always aware of what's going on. I'm the only person who has access to the reader's editor's mailbox. Right? So not even the editor knows what comes there. I'm the sole person there. And I think that's important because that gives me an independence, which I may not otherwise enjoy because I've been part of the newsroom, right? So far, I must say, I have not had any problem with any of my editorial colleagues. I'm sure, and I know that some of them are not exactly pleased with my views, but there it is, that comes, that's part of the territory. But nobody has shown any unwillingness to reply or respond after a little prodding. And Shekhar Gupta has actually never asked me anything, right? My column goes as it is written, barring, of course, any grammatical or factual errors that I might have inadvertently let slip by. But so far, I have found everyone quite willing. And since, you know, you brought up that business of the French calling it the mediator, since I see myself as a kind of mediator and negotiator, if you will, it helps for me to try and understand what happened and then to try and communicate that to the reader. For instance, I think my piece is about to appear in the next 2 days on our reporting on Lakhimpur in general and on what we did. And one of the things that I would not have known had I not talked to the people who went there was that the connectivity was so poor. There was no Google Maps. They couldn't find their way there. They just had to stop along the way. They couldn't take notes in the way they normally did on their phones. They went back to sort of traditional journalism, and why it became such a difficult assignment in many ways, right? And I wouldn't have been able to, I hope I've been able to communicate some of that to the readers if I didn't have the ability to engage with them. But as I said, I am independent. I do not play a day-to-day role any longer.
Right. I think this is also important in terms of, again, the organizational location, the distance between the RE and the editorial leadership, and so on and so forth. And Siddharth, again, I'm sort of reminded of a line which was there in Panneer's column, where he said that the role of an ombudsman is not only to identify what went wrong, but also to work on a visible mending process. Can you hear me, Siddharth?
Sorry, could you repeat that? Your voice broke.
Yeah. So no, I'm just quoting from another of Panneer's column, and it's a striking line where he says that the role of an ombudsman is not only to identify what went wrong, but also to work on a visible mending process. And I'm wondering, as a sort of as an editor proprietor, and you could perhaps even speculate because you've worked with different kinds of leading organizations, what could be the kind of impediments for such an internal, visibly mending process?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and fortunately, we haven't ever had to encounter this kind of an issue either at the Wire or earlier at the Hindu. But I would say that I wouldn't name the channel, but let us say that the news channel which recently showed footage that was of a video game and passed that footage off in primetime news as footage of, passed those visuals off as footage of the Pakistani Air Force intervening on behalf of the Taliban in the Panjshir Valley, right, shortly after the Taliban had captured Kabul. And it took, I think, less than 24 hours before people discovered that this was from a video game and had nothing to do with what was going on in Afghanistan. The channel offered no explanation. It simply just pulled the news. Or earlier, when channels reported, they showed pictures of graves of Chinese soldiers and tried to present this as people whom the brave Indian Javans had managed to kill at Galwan, right? And all of this got exposed on social media, but the viewer of those channels would have no insight into the fact that this information is completely wrong. So if you had a reader's editor or an ombudsman in those channels, would be to say, guys, what's going on? We shouldn't do this. Take corrective. So if it's possible for just visual imagery to be passed off as actual footage, I mean, leaving aside the wish of an editor or an anchor or a proprietor to do kind of pro-government propaganda or narratives, you still need to be credible in what you do, right? So even if you want to be a propagandist, for heaven's sake, don't source images from a television game and pass it off as, because you'll be caught out in a few hours, right? So even if it is to urge caution in the implementation of a bad agenda, but somebody needs to ask a question in that organization that how did we screw up like this, right? So yeah, I mean, like, and in fact, it shouldn't be the case that a public editor or an ombudsperson is the one doing that. I mean, for heaven's sake, the anchor himself, the editor-in-chief herself or himself should be livid at this kind of error being telecast, right? So the place where those conversations and those corrective actions are most needed and are most difficult are also places that don't give a damn. And so this is the sad reality. Print or scroll or the Wire, whatever our feelings may be, or the Hindu or other kind of credible, respectable media platforms, whatever mistakes that are made are never of that magnitude. And if they are, I think by and large would be much more receptive to suggestions of corrective advice offered by the ombudsperson. So I think that the quote you mentioned from Paneer's column, yes, I mean, particularly if mistakes emerge which are which suggest that there's something systematic or something underlying which is wrong in the way in which a media platform is approaching. So it could be that in coverage of Home Ministry or in coverage of Kashmir, there's too much reliance on what the army or what the Home Ministry is saying, and not enough secondary verification. And maybe a couple of errors have crept in because of that. Then the role of the ombudsperson would be to say, guys, maybe there's something wrong in the way that
I think we seem to have again lost Siddharth on this one. Yeah. And I think maybe I can sort of put this to Ram in the sense that the one, of course, is the issue of the mending process. B is the issue of the mending process being visible. Okay. And I'm wondering whether this visibility should perhaps also have something for journalists in other organizations here. That if there is one organization which has an RE and has a mending process, to use Paneer's word, which is visible, what kind of signal does that send to journalists and other organizations, whether they have a RE or not?
I don't know if I quite got your question. Well, obviously, it will be a positive signal to journalists, not just journalists, I would say to other media organizations, that there is one should, and it is possible to have a amending process without, you see, that's important, without seeming to find fault. It's not, it's not a question of finding fault. So that would send out a very positive message, provided other organizations see it as, something to learn from. Now, I mean, but the good question is that, why 15 years is it, Paneer, since the Hindu started, set up its office of reader's editor? We still have less than a handful of organizations with that position, whether in the electronic media, print media, or otherwise. But there, I would like to, make one point, that the reader's editor can't replace or shouldn't replace an internal verification correction system. If you place that responsibility on the reader's editor, then in a sense you are passing the buck, so that you should be the one setting up systems, so that other than the most big breakdowns, that they don't come to the reader's editor. The second thing is I would like to add here is that it is a big responsibility for the reader's editor to tell himself that he or she is not the editor. And often, in fact, when I was at Scroll, I said I would advise, I would have to keep telling myself that I am an external reader's editor. I am not a substitute editor, that I'm not there to say, do this, do that, why have you done this, why have you done that? I mean, it is there's a subtle difference, but there is a difference. I mean, if you don't accept that difference, then eventually you lose the trust of the organization that you are working with. But to come back to your question, but if this is done visibly and honestly, then it should send out positive messages to journalists and to organizations. Because as I come back to what I said in the beginning, we are in an environment where there's a huge amount of mistrust. There's mistrust to readers of publication, there's mistrust of journalists, of the editors for certain reasons. So journalists with their publishers, journalists with their organizations, etc. So visible, honest, open mending processes will go a long way, but will that happen? I mean, I don't know.
I mean, that connects quite clearly with the observations which, two of you made about just a fistful of news organizations actually have this role. And even in that fistful, I don't know of any television news organization who has had or have a reader's editor, and which perhaps, many of the sort of examples which Siddharth were talking about were in a sense dealing with television, and given both the format and the fact that it's sort of largely visual based here, there are perhaps more layers where the reader's editors could have a role to play here. We've hit an hour. I could just perhaps have one sort of round in terms of looking a little bit at the social media and what that has done to the role of the reader's editor, because when that designation was and the role was defined, we didn't have the sort of social media, and over the years, that role has evolved with certain kind of protocols, which perhaps in many cases may come from print itself here. So I'm wondering whether, and this is open to all of you here, whether the kind of challenges that social media puts to the role of the reader editor, and not just in terms of nuts and bolts which Shailaja talked about, but perhaps normatively, that here there is a here there is a window to get to know sort of what readers are thinking, rightly or wrongly, in polite language or otherwise. But what does that do to this whole idea of not knowing what the reader is saying here? And this is, of course, the last question. Any of you could take it. But I would like to sort of come to Siddharth before I'll come back to this question. But Siddharth, again, because it got cut off at that point, the observation I had was that very few organizations do have this role. And out of that very, very few, I don't see any television news organizations having that. And the examples which you talked about, most of them do connect with television news here, So, which of course is an amplifier for what happens, a lot of what is carried out in the press and in the news organizations. So perhaps that could be a point of discussion in terms of the impediments faced by television organizations and the format of television itself to make it being amenable to something which the RE could address on there.
That you're muted.
How do I unmute myself? Yeah, NDTV had experimented with ombudsperson. I think they had Justice Bhagwati for some time. I'm not sure how effectively that worked. And many TV stations subscribe to the News Broadcasters Association, and so the kind of external regulation for more serious kind of complaints. But they really ought to have in-house procedures to deal with things on a rolling basis. Vibodh, before I didn't want to, I had mentioned that we had to change the name, change the designation of Pamela.
Ombudsperson, and I did notice your blurb in Scroll uses all the three phrases: readers editor, public editor, and ombudsman at different parts of time in that description.
So the reason we had to change, the reason we dropped referring to Pamela as the public editor is because it began when Jai Shah, Mr. Amit Shah's son, when he filed his defamation case against Rohini Singh and the Wire's editors for a story that we had done on his business affairs, also dragged in the public editor. And the fact is that much as we try to argue at lower levels of the judiciary, that the public editor actually has nothing to do with content before it is published, and that her role kicks in only after something is published, and that she's not even a member of staff. But it's been 5 years. We haven't managed to convince anybody that Pamela Philippou should be taken off that case. And we found that subsequent cases that were being filed also, there were references to taking the public editor to court and this kind of thing. So we decided that discretion is the better part of of terminology, and we said, okay, if the title public editor is creating these confusions in the mind of would-be litigants, so it's best just to call her an ombudsperson, because it would be ridiculous to try to drag an ombudsperson to court on a defamation case because of content that publication carries, when her role is precisely to adjudicate on complaints about that content.
This is in a sense interesting in terms of what sort of how does a regulatory framework look at the kind of terminologies that we come up with. And I think there is a larger discussion about the way in which the RE is located in the evolving regulatory framework, and perhaps we can leave that for another time. If I can just perhaps then, with your permission, close this this panel. It's been really sort of at least interesting for all of us being part of this. Just a couple of points in terms of what I see is the fact that we don't see this role in very many organizations, especially in broadcasting. And we also, of course, see that some organizations who had introduced this role subsequently seem to have discontinued it. The second thing which I sort of take back is the fact that with the coming of the digital media, there are numerous other means for readers to project their concerns and grievances, okay, rightly or wrongly. Not only to the news organization per se, but of course to the world at large. However, the role of the RE carries a dual responsibility, which seems to have come out of the discussion here. Not just engaging with the reader, but also engaging with the editorial leadership in different kind of capacities there. And that, in a sense, for me, seems to define what the kind of crucial pillar an RE could play in fostering accountability in the press here. Thank you very much, all panelists and viewers, for joining this edition of the Media Foundation's Dialogue series. I also thank the program's team at IIC for hosting and organizing this panel discussion. I hope all of you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.